I studied first Latin and Greek and then Roman languages, French and Italian. And I like youngsters and I wanted to learn them something, to teach them. So I became a teacher in 1985 in an art school. What is very important is to take their interest and to connect, to communicate on a connective way, to dare to look in their eyes when you communicate, to involve them all, but also to have discipline and attention for routines in your class structure.
That was the voice of Karin Heremans, a school leader based in Antwerp, and someone who has spent decades working right at the front line where young people are forming their identities, where tensions show up early, and where response really matters. And that's what this episode is about. Because prevention doesn't start in security services or crisis response. It starts much earlier, in schools, in families, in everyday environments where people learn how to disagree, how to deal with conflict, and how to live with difference. What we are really exploring here is a simple but difficult question. Where does peace live in a society, and what does it take to build it day to day?
I became a school principal 1 week before 9/11. I had no experience by managing a school. I only had experience by managing a class. And from one moment to another, our school was in a crisis. Why? Because it's a school in the center of Antwerp with more than 60 nationalities. The world is coming to us every day and we don't need to do anything for it. In those days, there were no social media, but even, I remember it when I'm talking about it, from one day to another, teachers, students, they were each other's enemies. There was a big polarization. Why? Because our prime minister, he asked 1 minute of silence for the victims of the World Trade Center in America. And in certain classes, we had a lot of children from ex-Yugoslavia, and they were very angry because for their relevance, families, friends, no one never asked a minute of silence. So I was there and I thought, what's happening now? What I need to do? And then I turned back to the principles I used in my class as a teacher. And I thought I need to connect with them. I need to find something universal. I need to let them free to express their emotions. And then I need to connect again. It's like a circle. I used that circle also in my classes. So I went to talk with them and I listened to all their emotions. And I said, okay, let's hold another minute of silence. But a minute of silence against terrorism, against extremism, against violence, against war in the world for everyone you lost all over the world. So we made it universal. We let the emotions come out, and I can assure you it was very, very, very silent. And now, more than 20 years later, we had so many minutes of silence, it became a tradition in the school because we learned a lot about that. We did the same on the 7th of October for the Israeli victims. And it was very, very, very silent. But we also did it several times for the victims in Gaza. And in a certain way, we try to look to the conflicts in the world on a multi-perspective way, without judging. What we are judging is violence, is extremism, it's terrorism.
What are the practices that you had with a very, very extreme example of this very outside the normality of what an educator usually thinks about and does to safeguard young people during this extreme polarity on the outside, a Muslim majority school where there will be a lot of suspicion? Can you talk me through some of your approach at that time?
In a certain moment, it started 2012, something was happening. our values that we defended so much after 9/11, the pedagogical project we worked on reciprocity, it was threatened. I thought, what's happening now? Teachers, they were very concerned about some youngsters. Parents also, they came to school and they said, what's happening? There are men in the streets talking with our students. At a certain moment, I had a conversation with four young boys, and I tried to focus on their life goals. They were only 14. They wanted to start praying at noon. They wanted to wear religious clothes. They wanted boys and girls to be split. I said, what do you want to do? And he answered, I want to give my life for Allah. But at that moment, I really didn't realize he wanted to leave for Syria. So I asked another question to him, and I said, but you want a family, you want a wife, and you want to marry, and children. And he answered, Allah would take care of all this. And I stayed in my office. I invited their parents, and the parents said, we don't know what's happening. We see them on the streets, and we see people talking with them, preaching with them. We don't know. And 3 weeks later, I received a phone call from the police, and one of the boys left for Syria. And that was the beginning of a very intense period in Belgium, because it was really before we had a policy at the national level, before we had the city policy. So we needed to invent strategies, methodologies for ourselves. And I remember the teachers coming in my office crying and saying, we already have so many things to do. We need to learn them. We want to learn them, languages, mathematics. But we are not experts in radicalisation. Can you help us, please? And so we started to experience for ourselves. And we developed a methodology based on my teacher experience to connect in a creative way, but also to counter. And for countering, you need experts. And that's why the holistic multi-agency approach is so important. That's why the prevention or the de-radicalization process, you cannot do it alone. You need partners, you need a network. Very often in education, they say you need a village to raise a child, but you also need a village to do on prevention and to de-radicalize if you have a radicalized youngster.
Where along the line, after you show these inclusive universal values, do you see the impact in how the students relate to one another, how they relate to teachers, to the educators? What kind of differences do you see?
The differences we see is that they learn themselves to look to the things happening in the world from different perspectives and to respect also the point of view of the other. We put in the middle of that conversation a circle of basic values, European democratic values. And we also learn them to live and to communicate together in a reciprocal way. So we changed tolerance into reciprocity. And I think personally that is very important in every human relationship. If it is friendship or love or just professional, reciprocity and respect for another's view, and try to communicate on an empathic way without judging, that's very important. And that's what they learned from those methodologies.
How do we help them steer clear of harmful online presences? Is it possible, or do we have a way forward that we can really do all of these together meaningfully?
We are doing it. A lot of teachers in Europe are doing it. But the job of a teacher became very heavy those days, because 30 years ago they went to their class with their books and everyone listened, and that's not the case anymore those days. But a lot of teachers all over Europe are doing it and are learning and are having those trainings and courses, and they really want to do it for the youngsters, and that's very important.
I ask everyone this question, is that considering, your very powerful comment at the start, which you began your journey as a principal during 9/11, how hopeful are you going forward?
I'm working on these world topics more than 25 years. When I started as a principal, I would never have been taught that I would need to work with foreign terrorist fighters, neither that I would deal with online grooming. But we, teachers all over Europe, schools, survived all those crises. So I'm a positive person, and I think we learn from what our experiences. More and more people are convinced they cannot do it alone. More and more people are convinced we need collaboration at the national level, at the European level. And I think we need to develop more that holistic multi-agency approach, online and offline, to build a positive future for youngsters in Europe.
So I'm working as a program manager at the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law, which is an international intergovernmental organization that deals with capacity building on terrorism, and I still work on the rehabilitation side of things. This time more with judges and prosecutors. I'm currently also co-leader of the thematic panel on prison rehabilitation and reintegration and the EU Knowledge Hub. And prior to that, I was working at the French Ministry of Justice in a unit in charge of combating violent radicalisation.
That was Julian Lottie, who brings a perspective that sits right at the intersection of systems and individuals. From working inside the French justice system to now operating at a European level, he's been directly involved in how we understand, manage, and respond to radicalisation, particularly in prison and rehabilitation settings. And that's what's interesting in what he's describing to us. It isn't abstract. This is happening in real environments, with real people, where the stakes are high and the margin for error is small.
Just to give you a few elements on the overall, say, context and strategy in prison setting and in the open environment in France, there have been, as you've said, large numbers of terrorists, convicted terrorists, as well as common law offenders identified as radicalized. When I was in office a few months ago, there were close to 900 individuals pertaining either to one category, so of the terrorists, convicted terrorists, or common law offenders radicalized. So quite important numbers, and these numbers were even higher a few years ago. And so the penitentiary administration, as part of an interministerial plan, had articulated a strategy in prison and also in the open environment for people who are being followed by the probation services outside of the prison walls, so to say. A strategy that is a mixed regime of both dispersal of radicalized and terrorist inmates and regrouping. Concentration and dispersal model, mixed regime. The main idea is that based on a thorough assessment and depending on the risk of getting into violent actions and the risk of spreading the ideology, one inmate is either placed in a dedicated unit, a radicalization disengagement unit, at the isolation unit if the risks are too high, or in the general population.
In the hub, we're interested in what works, not only what works for a specific type, as you said, specific type of radicalization, but for broader dynamics. Was there an example of an approach that you feel really addresses that radicalized person and can help bring them back from the brink?
I think in every work on rehabilitation, this approach is at the heart of it. But I don't think that it must be opposed to security, whether of the other inmates or of society in general. I think that there is one really fundamental and key idea is that exit work, disengagement, is an integral part of the security response to the risk of terrorist reiteration, to preventing recidivism, and that the sentence itself has to have meaning and has to bring perspective, and it needs to be worked on as early as possible. But really, I think I cannot stress this enough, but it is often opposed, the security concerns with the rehabilitation or exit work. And I think it sends the wrong idea, because one cannot, in a way, exist without the other. And the rehabilitation and exit work truly is not just complementary, but an integral part of the response. And so for the inmates in these units, of course, depending on the profiles, the security measures are reinforced, and this is obviously something that's taken into account. But the programs, whether individuals or collective activities, are really meant to, despite the necessary security precautions being taken, this work is always adopting an approach that's here to also, in a way, build trust between the professionals and the inmates, or more than trust. I think the more correct term would be a working relationship, because in the end, this is what it is about. And certainly, again, going back to this idea that exit work is very much part of the security response. If we would not, as an administration or as practitioners, provide perspectives, provide means for reintegration, then we would fail in the attempt at preventing recidivism. So that's why I believe that, call it like this, the humane approach is ever present, because this is really the way, and also from a security perspective, but this is the way, the most effective way into making sure that we are effectively preventing recidivism.
It must be hard at times where there's an example of someone, a radicalized person who has committed maybe a public offense, and there's maybe potentially a lot of public pressure around that. Or even in cases where there might be security officials in those cases that are seeking for a more punitive response, right? Like, how do you manage to maintain the balance?
Yes, I think it's of course it's ever present, this tension. I think that we are, as workers in this field, whatever our position is, we are constantly battling the idea that, on the one hand, providing exit work, disengagement programs for terrorist or radicalized inmates is charity. This is often something that we have to fight, this idea. And on the other hand, we also have to battle the idea that we're only seeing it through a security lens, and that it is too heavy in terms of security measures. So there is always this tension. On the one hand, people saying that this is charity and we are being too naive in promoting exit work, and then on the one hand, that these people should not be incarcerated at all. And so I think it's always tough to find a balance, and that is why this fundamental idea that we need to reconcile these two things into one. That is, if we want to secure society and prevent recidivism and terrorist reiteration, the security response alone is not sufficient, and the work on rehabilitation is an integral part of the response. And we sometimes have specific moments where this tension really rises. To give you an example, when terrorist inmates or radicalized common offenders are leaving prison, there are sometimes a judicial measure that imposes that they follow a program in a center that is created and organized by a CSO, which is a partner to the Ministry of Justice. And part of what this CSO does first is to have a continuity of the rehabilitation work that was undertaken in prison. And also it provides the possibility of housing. And this possibility of housing is can be one of the thing that really crystallizes this tension. And again, we need, I think that experts from Stratcoms will be better than me in explaining this, but I think that it's also our responsibility to really build this narrative of we are not just providing housing because it's charity or because we want to help this population more than another. We are very well aware of the budgetary restraint that we have as an administration, that the public has. But we need to convey the idea that proposing and providing housing in this case, of course, always bearing in mind the security risks. But when we do resort to housing, it needs to be understood as a mean, again, to protect society. And that actually when you have an inmate that is just leaving prison and is homeless as soon as he leaves prison, he is more at risk at reiterating. But obviously, this is true for every inmate. It can be even more shocking when we talk about terrorists and radicalized offenders. But yeah, I think that can be definitely an example where this tension is really highlighted.
Apart from the things that you've mentioned, earlier on you mentioned about poetry and other types of approaches. Have you seen, from your perspective, a particular type of approach that is more effective than others for helping radicalized persons disengage?
It's again complicated to isolate one successful disengagement program. There is one, so it's a little aside from your question, but there is also always a challenge as to how can we effectively assess the effectiveness of our programs. And we've had back at the Ministry of Justice, we've had an independent team of researchers who were tasked to do precisely that, assess the effectiveness of the disengagement programs and the overall strategy. And I remember in a meeting with them talking about the criteria that could be implemented to assess this. And the difficulty was that in order to properly discriminate one program and say that this is the one that really helped disengage this person, we will need a control group. But having a control group in this setting is not possible, of course. We cannot have a group of convicted terrorists or radicalized offenders not undergo any disengagement program for the simple sake of seeing if the group that has been following a disengagement program has done any better in terms of disengagement. So it's always a challenge to highlight one particular program. What I can say is that we do see the effectiveness in working on the ideology. I think it's important to mention this because often enough, and especially now with the hybrid ideologies, several types of ideologies that are currently emerging, we tend to set aside the ideology. But what we do see from the work that we've conducted in France is that ideology matters. And working on this aspect has proven to be efficient, especially resorting to experts in Islamic studies who are not chaplains or imams, but they are academics who are going to share with the inmates about history, about contextualizing certain texts. And we do see that this approach often enough provides answers and really fosters the disengagement work.
My final question to you would be, in 5 years, do you think that our societies are more likely to be able to continue to positively find ways of tackling radicalization?
I think that there is room to be worried, but it's also, I think, a time to make sure that this work is really solid and can be questioned and this is important that it's questioned on the way it works, but that in the overall philosophy of things, let's say, the exit work and rehabilitation work is clearly understood as part of the answer. This is something that I've stated before, but again, I think that this is the major challenge. I think that what can be worrying is the shrinking that we can partially see and that we can fear in the resources that are put for rehabilitation work and exit programs. But the worst, I believe, element would be that this aspect of exit work and rehabilitation is completely set aside because it is not considered as effective enough, and that only security measures will be favored over rehabilitation. I think that we need to be cautious in our messaging as well, and we need, wherever we are standing in this field, making sure that we convey this idea that rehabilitation and security is the same thing in a way. It works hand in hand.
So there you have it. Two really important conversations. And what stands out from them, to me at least, is that prevention isn't abstract. It lives and breathes in very real places. In classrooms, relationships, in conversations, long before anything becomes visible as a problem. And when those systems are under pressure, as Julian shows, it becomes about something even more fundamental. Trust, timing, and doing your very best to understand the person behind the behavior. What both Karin and Julian show is that there isn't a single solution. There isn't a single moment where things change magically. It's layered, it's gradual, it's hard work, and most of all, it depends on people working together across systems. In that, prevention and security are the same. Thank you for listening to the EU Knowledge Hub on Prevention of Radicalisation podcast. You can hear the full conversations with our guests in the show notes and explore more about the Hub's work, the people I speak with, and the policies shaping prevention efforts across Europe. Join me next time. I'm Drew Mikhael.